Lecture 1: Historical Background of Indian Foreign Policy. India is one of the most ancient civilizations of the world, and it is not surprising that it has enjoyed for millennia very happy relations with other major civilizations in the world. It has traded with them, it has exchanged ideas, and has lived peacefully with most of them. 3 centuries before the birth of Christ came a Macedonian conqueror hoping to annex India, reach the banks of Ganges, Alexander the Great. He did not succeed in doing so, but somebody accompanying him, a traveler called Megasthenes, has left a very detailed account of the then India. The book Indica is not available in entirety, but excerpts are valuable enough. They tell us about the Mauryan Empire, and they tell us about an extremely interesting exchange between a Mauryan emperor who exported some Indian philosophers to the court of Seleucus Nicator, who was a satrap in Bactria in the northwest frontier of India, then India, undivided India, and received in exchange quite a few casks of wine, delicious one, imported from Greece. Is an interesting case of early brain drain from this country, however minuscule, and import of goods of conspicuous consumption. But let's keep that apart. Even before this, there were contacts between India and the then Iran, known as Faras. Even before that, if you go back to another 2,500 years and go back to the valley of Indus, Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, excavations have revealed evidence of India's trade with Sumer and Babylon. This is not to only satisfy one's patriotic pride. It is a fact of history that India has had a lively tradition of interacting with the world outside. Go back a few centuries, come down to the dawn of the first millennium, and we have traces of India's contacts with Southeast Asia. In countries as far off present-day Vietnam, there flourished Hinduized kingdoms called Champa and Funan. And they were called Hinduized kingdoms not by chauvinistic Indian historians, but by a respectable French historian, Paul Cédès. These days, we are very sensitive. We think it is politically incorrect to refer to this area as Greater India, but that is what it was. If you look at the map, even the political map today, it refers to countries called Indochina. This is where the two spheres of influence intersected: the Chinese influence of culture and economical domination, and the Indian sphere of influence. You have very interesting testaments to this exchange. You have the Hinduized empires in Indonesia, Srivijaya, Shailendra, Majapahit, the massive stoop of Borobudur, even Ramayana and Mahabharata as part of their epic tradition. Or you move across to present day Cambodia, and you have one of the largest, most fantastic temples on earth called Angkor Wat, which is a legacy of Hinduism and Buddhism. You come to present day Myanmar, Burma, and you have pagodas and Buddhism. You have Siam, Thailand, you have Laos. You look anywhere in Southeast Asia, and you have traces in language, in art, in culture, in architecture, in concept of kingship, which take us back to a period when India was a dominant influence in this region. Dominant in the best sense of the word, not political domination, not economic domination, but a lively cultural interaction. You have the historic spice route, which originated in Moluccas, through Indonesia, came to Sri Lanka, Bay of Bengal, eastern seaboard of India, down to Kerala, Cochin, up again to Arabian Sea. What we must remember, that much before the dawn of Islam, the Arabs had been visiting India. They were the ones who had first mastered the monsoon winds, and actually the word monsoon derives from the word Mosam, not the other way around. And these Arabs built up a fantastical store of stories to justify high prices they were charging the Europeans for the aromatic spices. They would say that there's a bird called phoenix who makes its nest out of cinnamon sticks, and if the fire destroys and the phoenix is supposed to burn itself and rise from its ashes, and the nest burns, so cinnamon is in short supply. So they collected a high value, low volume commodities like cardamom, like pepper, like cloves, like cinnamon, and took them across and gave them to Romans, gave them to Greeks, and onwards there. There was also an equally important historical Silk route, which started from China, came through Central Asia, went on to Turkey, and like a great river system, it had tributaries and contributaries. They branched off. There was not one major silk route, but several small silk routes which joined the major silk route, and some of them passed through India, through Ladakh, through Kashmir, through Punjab, through Rajasthan, to the ports of Bhrugu Kutch, Broch, to Sopara, to present-day Surat, and maybe also to safe harbors, havens in what is present-day Mumbai. So these two great historic routes, the Silk Road and the Spice Route, India was at the cross section and it was exposed to a diversity of influences. We already talked about Southeast Asia, the architectural heritage, the linguistic shared heritage. Central Asia was no different. You had Bamiyan Buddhas testifying to the expansion of Buddhism through this route to Tibet and beyond to China. And you had, even in the days of the great Emperor Ashoka sending his son Mahendra and daughter Sanghamitra to take the message of Buddha, the message of peace to Nepal and to Sri Lanka and beyond. We have this extremely interesting interaction, not only of trade, not only of ideas, and it did not fall into the trap of a sectarian divide. Arabs converted to Islam, but this healthy intercourse continued. They took away with them from India material about Ayurveda, philosophical speculations, and you have people like Al-Baruni, whose Kitabul Hind, who came with Ghazni, but took back with him the knowledge base of India and exposed the rest of the world to what Indian thinking was all about. So the commerce in ideas, the commerce in commodities, and also the message of peace have been a legacy of ancient Indian history to present day. You come to the dawn of the first millennium, you have establishment of the Gupta Empire, and you have the Chinese travelers coming here, like Faiyan, like Huensang, in the time of Chandragupta II, in the time of Harsha, Emperor Harsha, spent many years here, and again forged this relationship, cemented this relationship, what the Chinese refer to as the ties with the Western world. India was a cornerstone of that. So we have this extremely interesting period in ancient Indian history when India was not only aware of the world without, but interacted with it very, very profitably. One could even suggest that this was the first wave of globalization, where it was not a project implemented by Americans or the West. It was a world bound together with mutual interest. This is where the concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the whole world being one family, flourished. What went wrong then? Why was this interrupted? I think what happened was when the Turko-Afghan Sultanate was established and later the Mughal Empire first flourished, then decayed, India was not interested in the world outside because the Muslim rulers were only having a range of interest confined to Khilafat, the Khalifa in Turkey, Byzantine Empire, and they were quite content to live independently, a life of luxury in this country. They made fabulous wealth, they spent it on majestic monuments, they patronized music, painting, etc. But the interest in the world without was lost. And this is where the Europeans took advantage of this. When the Europeans set their foot on this subcontinent, K.M. Panikkar has a very nice phrase to explain it. He says, Asia under Western dominance. But we are concerned more with India. It happened to the rest of Asia as well. But when the Europeans came here, and not only the Englishmen, the Portuguese came here, the French came here, the Dutch came, and the English came. There was a time when they fought amongst themselves for paramountcy of this country, for establishing factories, colonial control, exploiting the natural wealth of this country. They came as traders, they came rulers. Ultimately, the British triumphed over their rivals. But this was not always the case. Indians did encounter Portuguese who managed to remain a toehold in Goa for 400 years. There was even smaller enclaves in Chandannagar, in Pondicherry, which the French retained till the independence of India. The Dutch left earlier. But before the British had established colonial control and imperial domination over India, there was a time when the die was not cast in favor of the British, and there were the Marathas in west, there were Sikhs in Punjab in the north, and this was the Sikh empire which reached from Lahore till beyond Ladakh, all the way to Tibet. That's where the great General Zorawar Singh, sent by Ranjit Singh, perished. They had established control over Afghanistan. So from Darra-e-Khyber till the borders of Delhi, from Ladakh, what was known as Little Tibet, to almost the outskirts of Rajasthan, the Great Desert, it was one great empire of the Khalsas. There was an equally large, equally influential, equally rich dominion of the Nizam in Deccan, who was practically a sovereign ruler even when the Mughals were there. After Aurangzeb, I don't think that anybody could claim that they had any sway over this region. You also had a fabulous ruler in present day Karnataka, which was known as Mysore, Hyder Ali and his son Tipu. And Tipu had tried to take on the British by seeking help from the French. Now, there were embassies sent by Tipu Sultan to the French. There are accounts of the French taking an interest in anti British elements in Indian princes, but it never fructified. Napoleon was defeated. The world was restored in a non republican, non monarchical fashion in Europe. There was a concert of Europe. The system, which was studied by Henry Kissinger for his doctoral dissertation, the Metternich world restored, was a system based on treaties and alliances where the traditional major powers of Europe, Britain, France, Austria, Hungary, Prussia, and Russia on the margins, would among themselves divide the world and decide its fate. This was also the period of industrialization. This was also the period of colonial expansion. And these European powers were in a position, through their system of treaties and alliances, to divide the territory and the resources of the poor Asians, the Africans, and to a certain extent of the Latin Americans and settle their outstanding differences. The map had open spaces. A great game was being played between the British and the Russians for the control of Central Asia, or British between expanding British power in India and the Chinese Empire, which was in a very bad shape at that stage. But you had significance of buffer states like Afghanistan landlocked, Tibet landlocked, and which we see till present day. The problems can be traced back to the history of the great game, quote unquote, of the colonial period, or of contending spheres of influence between China and India, historically in Southeast Asia or in Central Asia. When the British came, it became a totally different thing. The British would give India a certain independence and autonomy to maintain a diplomatic representative where Indians were exerting, maybe in Sri Lanka as labor, maybe in China where they thought Indians would have a more neutral post of observation and inform their colonial masters. But the point is, it was the British interest which surpassed everything else. India was a crown and a jewel, but India did not have an independent policy. But Indian borders defined India's enemies and India's friends. This was a period when there was no air travel, there was no fast telecommunications, and the ship route was the ideal one. And Britain, being the largest naval power in the world, could easily dominate the naval routes, and that was the source of its power and a reflected glory of India. India also was divided between British India and almost 575 odd Indian princely states who were nominally sovereign but had no right of maintaining independent foreign relations or defense policies. They were sovereigns. They could mete out a life punishment to their subjects, capital punishment, but they could not conduct foreign relations. So this continued. What changed was, under the impact of British colonialism, there was a rise of national sentiment in India. And this national sentiment manifested itself in two different ways. There was a revival of memories of a glorious past of India before the colonial masters, the whites had come, the Firangis had come. It also was a sense of great unease that India had become backward, India had become poor, where it had been ahead of Europe in a short period of 150 odd years under British rule, because they had drained away Indian wealth, to use Dadabhai Naoroji's phrase, and also because Indians realized that they had passed by the European Enlightenment, the industrialization, the scientific revolution, and the advantages of the Renaissance. So there were people who were restless, and in the 19th century, we have three major names. There were many more, but the ones which stand out are Rabindranath Tagore, the great poet, Nobel laureate, who as a young man traveled to England, traveled to Europe, traveled to Latin America, traveled to Japan, traveled to Southeast Asia, and brought back images of the world very different from the British ruled India, and wanted to recast India in a modern cosmopolitan internationalist mode. What is interesting is Rabindranath Tagore was never a prisoner of narrow nationalism. He actually spoke eloquently against chauvinism, nationalism. He was a mind open to diverse influences, and he continued to do so all the way till his death, almost in 1940s. The other gentleman was Swami Vivekananda, a sannyasi who went and addressed in a very, very forceful manner the World Congress Parliament of Religions in Chicago and roused the audience, which was almost somnolent. But then, what the message he conveyed was that Indians were projected by British as weaklings, impotent, lazy, not capable of doing anything sensible. And he said that they were full of energy. All they needed was to regain their poise and claim what was legitimately their own. Muscular Hinduism was his contribution to the national movement. There were many other people. There was, for instance, Mahatma Gandhi, who had not become a Mahatma then. He went as a young student, 18-year-old, to England. Then he came back to India, returned to South Africa as a lawyer to practice there. And in South Africa, he was exposed to racism, to a worse kind of abuse. But Gandhi was a very sensitive man. He was not only worried about protecting his self-respect and honor, he was worried about fighting for a just cause of other dark-skinned people, non-whites, not only Indians. It included Chinese, it included Arabs, and he wanted to get them equal rights. This was not possible there. Gandhi also had a faith in the goodness of the British and the fair play of the British courts and justice. And for a long time, he volunteered during the Boer War to work in the ambulance corps. He also volunteered again when the First World War broke out. But slowly there was disillusionment with the British. At the same time, Gandhi was in correspondence with great men elsewhere. He was corresponding with the great Russian novelist, anarchist, philosopher Tolstoy, whose ideas influenced him deeply. He was reading deeply Ruskin, Thoreau, and he was influenced by these thinkers from America. He was also in correspondence with people like Romeo Rolla, who was staying in Switzerland, and he was having a lively interaction with great minds of his day. And I think Gandhi also, we tend to overlook, had a world view which was no less important for the formulation of Indian foreign policy as Rabindranath Tagore's. Very often we make the mistake of thinking that Nehru was the only one who had any interest in foreign affairs, who knew what foreign policy was, and he single-handedly crafted Indian foreign policy. While the historical facts are quite different. You could even take an example of like Maulana Azad. The gentleman was not educated in English medium. He was a traditional scholar of Arabic. He had received his education in the University of Al-Haram, but he was a very precocious young man. And he had become an editor and a writer of repute and a Muslim jurist before he joined the freedom struggle with great gusto. And you had these people who had an influence on the way Indian foreign policy or Indian national interest was defined in post-independence period. Take, for instance, Gandhi again. Gandhi wanted the Muslims and Indians to fight shoulder to shoulder in the freedom struggle against the British. He chose to support against some opposition the Khilafat movement. And this made people sit back and realize that there was a part of the world, other than the European world, which had been inherited to a great Islamic civilization, which had fallen into bad days, and which was also going an extremely interesting transition like India. There was nationalism of the Western variety. Kemal Ataturk had ended the Caliphate in Turkey and was forcing a certain kind of a secular social modernization, which traditional Muslims elsewhere were being resented. So I think there would be a long debate whether Gandhi did right to support Khilafat movement. Wasn't it the origin of pan-Islamic sentiment? But the fact is, the Indians became aware of an Islamic world. There is a very interesting case at this stage when Gandhi had come to India to seek support for the struggle of the Indians in South Africa. But slowly he realized that the greater fight was waiting to be fought in India. He was persuaded by a young Bihari peasant to go to Champaran. He got involved with Champaran. He started a satyagraha in Champaran. He set up an ashram there, and he never returned to South Africa after that. And the rest, as they say, is history. But the point is, these historical legacies we tend to overlook more often than not. At the turn of the century, India was very different. But by 1914, when the First World War broke out, I think the world changed drastically. And this is another story which needs to be told and remembered well. When the First World War broke out, Indian soldiers were recruited from all over, supposedly the martial tribes of India and castes of India, and fought on very many European fronts. They died in France, they died in Germany, they died in Italy, and they realized that there were other white men other than British who were different. They also realized that the British outside India behaved very differently. Those British who had not come to India, not ruled India, were far less arrogant. They were far more conscious of their poverty, of their economic deprivation, lack of education. Not everybody had a superiority complex like the British ruling Indians in India. So there was one element of slight restlessness which was brought back to India by these soldiers. And also there were people like Gandhi, people like Nehru, who thought that if the Indians were sacrificing their lives for Europeans on European battlefronts, why shouldn't the British be accelerating the move towards, if not full independence, towards autonomy and self rule in India? So there was a parallel stream of developments outside India and constitutional developments claiming slightly greater share of self rule in India happening. Another interesting dramatic event which took place during the First World War was the capture of power by the Bolsheviks in the Tsarist Russia. The Tsar's family was killed, the Tsarist regime was abolished, and a new kind of a state emerged which called itself the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, Soviet Union for short, USSR even more abbreviated. This was the third time a republic was confronting a traditional state of the monarchical variety or a democratic variety of the British or the French variety. The first was the American Revolution in the American Republic. Second was the French Revolution in the French Republic. Clock was turned back in France. Monarchy came. The Napoleon established an empire. Napoleon was defeated, but was succeeded by another regime, and it was different. But Soviet Union was a different state in another reason also. It claimed to be representing a certain ideology which was universalistic in its claim. It said the wretched of the earth should unite, they had nothing to lose but their chains. So it was an appeal across national borders to industrial labor, to peasants, that their interests were unified. It was an appeal against capitalism, against colonialism, against imperialism, because Lenin had that brilliant formulation that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. So there was a close relationship between capitalist exploitation and imperialism, and socialism, communism was going to confront it and going to be a natural ally of the colonial people. So there were people like Nehru, who were not communists, but who had been under the influence of socialists, Cyril Lasky, Fabian socialists, who thought that the Soviet Union was making a great experiment which India could emulate later. And Soviet Union, on its part, sponsored and organized in a very far-sighted manner conferences like Brussels Conference organized by the League Against Imperialism, in which Nehru participated, in Hatta participated, Ho Chi Minh participated, and a lot of these Afro-Asian leaders made their early ties. Nehru came back almost starry-eyed from the Brussels Conference and prepared a very detailed report for the Congress Party to consider. And many scholars for a number of years believed that this draft submitted by Nehru of a future policy of India, foreign policy of India, was the one which laid the foundations of Indian foreign policy in 1947. Obviously, this is not the case. The world in 1927 was very different from the world as it emerged after the Second World War in 1947. It was very different from 1927. India in 1927 was very different from India, divided India as it emerged in 1947. The world had changed, Soviet Union had changed, China had changed, America had changed, and Europe had changed once again in a devastating manner. Technology had changed. So I don't think that one can read too much in the 1927 draft submitted by Nehru to Congress Party, but the fact remains that there was interesting developments during the war which changed the thinking of Indian people about world, their own country, and the relationship between the two. Yet another thing needs to be underlined. This was the foundation and formation of the League of Nations. Interestingly, an idealistic experiment which was supposed to end the scourge of war for all time, which was supposed to lay the foundations for international cooperation between different nations, which was supposed to establish institutions which would make it easy to settle disputes through dialogue, not through a clash of arms, was a failure, was a massive failure. But it left behind a legacy which continued to guide the conduct of foreign relations of many democratic countries. Very briefly, why it failed is very simple. The father of the idea was Woodrow Wilson, the then President of the United States, but he, for some reason or the other, failed to persuade his own country to join the League of Nations or support it. Once America was not part of the League of Nations, there was very little hope that it would succeed. The League had idealistic ambitions, but it did not have the resources to control the dictators who had military power, like the Nazis in Germany, the fascists in Italy, the militarists in Japan, or the communists in Russia. So there were several clashes of interest. It was supposedly founded to help the process of decolonization, but it was a very complex system of mandates it put in place, which was difficult to appoint, and it made the mandate territories almost like adopted children controlled by their former imperial masters. So we have these problems. But the legacy of the League of Nations is important because it set up institutions which continue to be relevant in even in 21st century, like the World Court of the International Court of Justice, like International Postal Union, International Labour Organization, International Meteorological Organization, and also a whole lot of things which make telecommunications or maritime navigation possible. But that's another story. So these three things, the First World War and the impact on the common Indian of the First World War, their reassessment of British in India and other Europeans outside, hopes of support from a new kind of a country, a socialist country in Soviet Union, and also an international organization where pursuit of peace, pursuit of cooperation could take place, are the keystones, cornerstones of Indian foreign policy till present day. So we'll come to that. Now, there was an extremely interesting development around the same time. In Congress party, there were young Turks emerging, people like Nehru, people like Subhash Bose, people like Jayaprakash Narayan, who were interested in foreign policy, including youngsters like Dr. Ram Manohar Lohia, who for a short while worked as a secretary to Jawaharlal Nehru and was in charge of the overseas Indian Department of Indian National Congress, who had studied in different places. Nehru had studied in England, Jayaprakash Narayan had studied in America, Dr. Lohia had studied in Germany, and we already referred to Subhash Bose, who had studied in England and India. And these people had contending views of the emerging world in the 1930s. And they were suggesting different models for India to interact with the world as it was emerging. But all this became redundant because suddenly, after 20 years of uneasy peace, another war broke out. That was World War II. And World War II broke out at a stage when Indian national movement had gathered a certain momentum, and Indians were expecting to be compensated for their support to the British war effort. British were reluctant to do so, and the Indians ultimately opted to do the Quit India movement. British thought this was treason. Gandhi and all the leadership of Congress was put in the prison, and those people like Subhash Bose, who had managed to break out of their house arrest, escaped in a sensationally brave manner via Afghanistan to Germany, from Germany in a submarine equally daredevilry to Japan, founded the Indian National Movement, and took up armed struggle against the British. Now what happens is, we must keep in mind the course of the Second World War. And I think scholars like Srinath Raghavan have made a brilliantly insightful study. He's of the view that probably Indian freedom struggle, the one single thing which contributed most to it, was the experience of the World War. And this World War was different in many ways. The pendulum swung this way and then the other way around. The Americans did not join the war effort till the Japanese had bombed the Pearl Harbor. The Soviet Union did not join the war till it had been invaded. It had a secret pact with Nazi Germany, and when the Nazis betrayed that, then it became a patriotic war for the Russians, and it became a war on the citadel of socialism to which all communist socialists were supposed to join. So you have this extremely interesting thing when first the Axis powers, the Japanese, the Germans, and the Italians seemed to be winning. And then came the day when they tired out And the Americans joined in, the Russians joined in, and the combined forces were just too much for Germany and Italy and Japan. They were slowly tiring, but the war was not ending. And then there was yet more drama in store for the world. The atomic bomb was invented, and not only invented, was used over Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The devastation was perfect, and very odd way to say the devastation was perfect. Hundreds of thousands perished, were reduced to cinders and ashes. Only their shadows were imprinted on stones. Nobody then knew of the real horrors of radiation, of the radioactive contamination, people dying generations down the line of cancer. But what the world saw of the burnt bodies, maimed bodies was enough. So what happened was the atom bomb forced the Japanese to surrender and the war came to an end. This led to a very interesting situation that although Britain and France emerged on the victorious side with the Americans, Americans were the only country which had benefited from war. They had avoided devastation of their homeland. They had flourished because of the military industrial complex which was supplying arms and armaments to their allies. And also something else which happened, Britain and France were totally devastated. They were as badly hit by the war as the Germans. Their economic system was in a mess. Their industries were devastated and destroyed. They needed rehabilitation and aid. And it came to them in the form of American Marshall Aid to rehabilitate Europe and save it from the scourge of communism. On the other side, the Russians had also suffered huge losses. Their losses of lives were probably larger than anybody else. But the Russians were also in effective control of almost half of the Europe, half of Germany, and Eastern Europe. And they were reluctant to move out. The Soviet Union did not have atom bomb then, but nobody dared take them on because they were controlling. The Red Army was there in Berlin. Berlin was divided. It could be reunited only decades later. But the Soviets were not losing time. Their research was accelerated. They also very soon had a nuclear bomb, an atom bomb. Now, this is an incident which was to change the world political system almost totally. The erstwhile great powers of Europe were reduced to almost non-entities. They realized that they could not control their colonial empires at all. They had been replaced by two superpowers who had global interest, who had capacity to influence developments globally, who had the nuclear weapon, who were building on their own. But the two were not comparable. They had changed the balance of power to a balance of terror. But they were not equal. There was no parity. America was rich and Russia needed reconstruction, was poor. America was capitalist and Russia was communist. So an element of ideology came into foreign policy. India could not remain indifferent to it. So this was something the Second World War brought about in the historical context. This brought Nehru and his colleagues to an interesting threshold. Nehru wanted to rebuild India, have fast economic development, and he did not want to have any problems about lack of peace, struggle next door. He couldn't avoid it either because with independence had come partition and had brought new challenges. Pakistan had invaded Kashmir to claim large chunks of the territory for itself. So Nehru had to fight a war with Pakistan at that stage. Nehru was reluctant to have communal tension going up in the country. So he was prepared to make peace with Pakistan unilaterally. He had ceasefire unilaterally. He promised very short-sightedly that the issue of Kashmir would be decided by plebiscite and would be taken to United Nations. And this problem has remained historically extremely festering sore since that day. At the same time, the other problem was there. China, Maoist revolution succeeded, and Mao lost no time in trying to liberate, quote-unquote, Tibet. And this liberation was a forcible end of the Lamaist tradition in Tibet, severing its cultural connection with India, including trade routes being interrupted, and also almost a genocidal practice of dominating the Tibetans. Unfortunately, Nehru, following the advice of some of his advisors, decided to accept the suzerainty of China over Tibet. And people keep quibbling what is the difference between suzerainty and sovereignty. But the damage was done. India considered that Tibet was an integral part of China and lost its greatest bargaining chip in subsequent border negotiations with China. Now, this again is a problem which is rooted back, whether it is the border issue with China or the issue of Tibet or any other remnant issue, is dated back to the history of the immediate aftermath of the independence. Nehru again had to worry about getting economic assistance, technological aid to develop India. He decided to keep equidistance from capitalist and the communist, followed a policy of what he called non-alignment. Somebody thought it was a very opportunistic policy to take aid from both sides. Some thought that Nehru was suffering from delusions of grandeur, pacifism, and wanted to have an image of himself as an idealistic philosopher king, for instance, and sacrifice India's national interest. Nehru himself would say that idealism of today is realism of tomorrow. And maybe people accuse him of passivity, accuse him of neutrality, but Nehru himself was eloquent about defense of non-alignment. And I think for a period of 20 years, it succeeded. I mean, not completely. Nehru ruled India as a prime minister for 16 years, undisputed, more or less. But after 1962 war with China, he had lots of difficulties. And people with hindsight would say that Nehru failed because he had not been advised well by his advisors like K. M. Panikkar or Krishna Menon, who was sympathetic to the communists. He was not informed very well by the India's spy agencies, intelligence bureau, etc. The army was unprepared because they thought they would never have to fight a war. And some people say that Nehru suffered from hubris because he was the last Englishman. Some call him an inheritor of Curzon, and some call him the last Mughal, Grand Mughal. Nehru was a charismatic personality. Nehru has very many remarkable contributions to independent India as a builder of the nation. But the fact remains that whether it is in relationship with Pakistan or it is in relationship with China, there were major errors made because he did not read the lessons of history right. He did not realize that the Chinese had always distrusted barbarians outside the Great Wall. They were always an expansionist power. They did not accept anybody else as their equal. They had perforce to accept humility when the European powers subjugated them after the Boxer Revolution, made them addicts of opium, and took control of the coastal cities like Shanghai and islands like Hong Kong. But Chinese, once they regained power and regained the alliance with the Russians, which lasted for a short while, the Soviet Union, they did not budge 1 inch from what they thought was their historical inheritance. And Nehru thought that Zhou Enlai was being very friendly, Zhou Enlai was being very reasonable, but this was not the case. He thought that Pakistan and India could live in peace because they had a shared heritage. He did not realize that Pakistan, once it became a nation on the basis of religion, would not care very much about the shared heritage. Pakistan learned the lesson differently when Bangladesh went away, when religion was not enough to keep the two parts of Pakistan together. Language was the great divide. But unfortunately, the shared heritage is something in history which undergoes a change in the eyes of the inheritors. And you must keep that in mind when foreign policy is being formulated. But to come to another story, Nehru followed the policy of non-alignment and also laid out principles which may be called the pillars of Indian foreign policy of independent India. Non-alignment was there, so India remains outside the contest between the two superpowers. It was necessary for India to have a period of peace, to rehabilitate refugees, to make economic development. For to have peace, another principle was necessary, that you argue in favor of disarmament, first of all nuclear disarmament, and also for pacific settlement of disputes. So peace, disarmament, non-alignment, and things like Panchsheel, the resolution of disputes, non-interference in each other's affairs, was an equally important part. Then, of course, it was not only India. There were brush fires in the neighborhood. Vietnam was having a major war. Middle East, the Palestinians, Israelis were fighting. The British had given independence to some colonies, but not to all. So in Africa, there was Mau Mau rebellion. The French were fighting somewhere else. So the Indians had to walk on a very narrow and straight path. And Nehru said that there has to be Afro-Asian unity. We must stand together with one another. And we also must have a fight against colonialism in which we are united. So this united fight against colonialism and imperialism, racialism, disarmament, peace, international cooperation, became pillars of Indian foreign policy, which remained during Nehruvian period, despite the setback of the 1962 war, continued like that. There was a short interregnum. Nehru died, a broken man, a disillusioned man. He was succeeded by Lal Bahadur Shastri. Pakistan provoked India and attacked again. Lal Bahadur Shastri responded far more decisively. Indian army marched all the way up to the outskirts of Lahore, and Pakistan had to make peace. But Indians were magnanimous. They decided, in interest of peace in the subcontinent, they would tell Pakistan that we will withdraw from the territory which we are occupying. And at Tashkent conference, it was decided that each issue would be negotiated bilaterally. Unfortunately, Shastriji suffered a heart attack, died in Tashkent, and Indira Gandhi succeeded him. There is an interesting turning point in Indian foreign policy here. Mrs. Gandhi was Nehru's daughter, but she was a hardcore realist, not an idealist at all. She also was heading a government which did not enjoy a majority of its own. She was supported by the Communist Party of India, very closely aligned to Soviet Union. So you have a series of populist measures undertaken by Mrs. Gandhi, which also allow us to understand the relationship between domestic politics and foreign policy. She nationalized banks, she abolished privy purses in Indian state, princely states. She drew closer and closer to Soviet Union. She started buying arms and armaments from Soviet Union. The Soviets helped us in heavy industries. The Soviets helped us in all the commanding heights of economy, steel, chemical fertilizers, opticals, life-saving pharmaceuticals, space exploration, Antarctic exploration. And Mrs. Gandhi, by the time we reach 71, and the crisis in Bangladesh is brewing, has signed a treaty of peace and friendship and some with Soviet Union, and some people say that non-alignment is dead by then. And India insisted that we had not given up non-alignment. We were only facing a threat, and we had a time-tested friend, and the Soviets had supported us on Kashmir by using their veto against Pakistan and America repeatedly, so we could trust them. And it is because of Soviet support then that we could take on the American Seventh Fleet, the steamship Enterprise, the machinations of Henry Kissinger and Nixon during that period. And let's not forget that by that time, Americans were thinking of withdrawing from Vietnam, where they were stuck in a quagmire. And they wanted somehow to save their face and move out. So they couldn't take on India wholeheartedly. At the same time, Kissinger was trying to persuade Nixon to make up with Soviet Union and to make up with Maoist China, which they did a little later in the 1970s. But we are jumping the story and going ahead faster than is necessary for us. Mrs. Gandhi became heroic figure like Joan of Arc after the liberation of Bangladesh. It made her a little more arrogant, a little more dictatorial, and perhaps that is what led to her imposing emergency after losing an election on technical grounds in 1975. She arrested her opponents, and there's a dark chapter in Indian democracy and judiciary. But the fact remains that Mrs. Gandhi also announced elections in 1977, which she lost, which goes to prove that the elections were held freely and fairly, and people in jail, like George Fernandez, won from jail without campaigning amongst their constituency. But there was a period when Morarji Desai was the Prime Minister, and these people, the Janata Party people, did not have an interest in foreign policy or the world outside India. They were busy with their own squabbles. They were busy with their fetishes, dogmatic, spiritual or otherwise. They were bickering, and this 2-year period was wasted. Mrs. Gandhi came back to power. And when she came back to power, people thought she would have learned her lesson and she would probably behave differently. But we only speculate. Mrs. Gandhi, when she came back to power, was confronted with the separatist insurgency in Punjab. The Khalistanis were violent, and Mrs. Gandhi had to use force to suppress it. She ultimately did not succeed in doing this. Long story, but the terrorism could only be contained by brutal force on the other side, and Mrs. Gandhi was constrained to send army into Harmandir Sahib, the Golden Temple, the Operation Blue Star, and she paid the price for it ultimately by being assassinated in reprisal for what she had done, desecration of the Sikh shrine. At the same time, trouble was bickering somewhere else. Mrs. Gandhi was succeeded by her son, Rajiv Gandhi. But by the time Rajiv came and he was holding hope of a total change, there was another threat looming in the south of India. The liberation tigers of Tamil Eelam, led by Prabhakaran, one of the most dreaded terrorists, as he turned out to be, was somehow successful in convincing Indians that Indian national interests would be served if Indians supported the Lite. Now, Indians had a domestic political constraint also. The Tamil parties, the Dravid parties in Tamil Nadu, had a natural affinity and empathy for the Tamils in Sri Lanka. But the moment the Indians tried to support the Tamils, not militarily, but on humanitarian grounds, like they had done in Bangladesh, there would be a great fissure between the Sri Lankans, the government, which had been non-aligned, reasonably friendly to India. The Sri Lankans would suspect that the Indians were creating larger fractures in their social fabric by supporting Tamils vis-a-vis Singhals, Hindus and Muslims vis-a-vis the Buddhists, and interfering politically. Ultimately, there was a dispatch of the Indian Peacekeeping Force IPKF in Sri Lanka. It did not succeed in doing what it was because unfortunately the Litte people trained at one stage by Indian Army knew how Indian Army did counter-terroristic jungle warfare. Lots of lives were lost, and including Rajiv Gandhi ultimately lost his life to a person who was trying to have a revenge for his leaving the Litte undefended towards the end. So the problem is that these historical problems, we go back to history and talk about the neighborhood, and we go back to 1950s, and we say in Nehruvian period, we had a treaty of friendship signed with Nepal when Nepal wanted it, and the Nepalese monarch was a puppet in the hands of his Rana prime ministers. He took shelter in Indian embassy, was brought to Delhi, and the Ranas were defeated ultimately, and this peace treaty was there. But ever since, Nepal has nursed a grudge that the treaty was signed in a period of duress, under stress, and is more favorable to Indians. Now, anybody who reads the treaty can see to it that it is perhaps more favorable to the smaller neighbor, landlocked Nepal, than to Indians. But the point is, it's the perceptions which matter in foreign policy. The Indian foreign policy has suffered because neither the people who formulate foreign policy in Delhi or implement it, nor the neighbors have been careful enough to read history and draw the right lessons from it. Then we come to a period which is post-Rajiv Gandhi period. And again, we must keep in mind that interesting things are happening. The world is changing. First, there is end of Cold War. There is Detente. Americans and the Russians have come together. Americans and the Chinese have come together. And that leaves very little scope for anybody like India to be non-aligned to play a peace broker's role. It also is that if the Americans and Russians have made up, there is very little space on international arena for India to negotiate from a position of strength for either technology or for diplomatic support. Also, the interesting part is this, that once the European Union has emerged as a major actor after regional integration experiment in Europe, again India has to worry about renegotiating its contracts, social contracts if I may say so, with European powers as a European Union, not bilateral with France, bilateral with Germany, bilateral with Italy, and so on and so forth. Also, during Nehruvian period, the very significant role was given to an organization like the Commonwealth of Nations. They had all been earlier parts of the British colonial empire. But Commonwealth slowly ceases to have any meaning either in terms of foreign exchange, sterling balances, English language, education, legal system. More people would much rather go to America. More people would much rather settle down there. More people would argue that we had interests in Europe which were more important than living back in a period of nostalgia and Raj with the British. So this was happening towards the last decade of the 20th century. Soviet Union had disintegrated after Glasnost perestroika practiced by Mikhail Gorbachev. There was a period of a remarkably distressing anarchy in Soviet Union. They were on the brink of economic disaster. And for one time, India was the largest source of foreign exchange earnings for them. We were buying their aircraft carriers. We were buying their aircraft fighters and bombers. We were buying helicopters. We were investing heavily in Russia, but post the disintegration of Soviet Union. But at the same time, we again had a problem when India itself embarked on a path of economic liberalization, which meant that we started moving towards the Americans. Economic liberalization, whether China calls it a fourth great modernization or India calls it economic liberalization, is basically choosing the capitalist path through any other name. And it inevitably takes you towards America. It is not only Rajiv Gandhi who prepared the path for this. It is not only Narsingh Rao and the Finance Minister Manmohan Singh who opted for this. It was also Atal Bihari Vajpayee and the NDA who agreed. Now, this is what is interesting. Jaswant Singh ji had a series of talks with Stove Talbot, and that is what Raja Mohan calls the crossing of the Rubicon. And you don't cross the Rubicon backwards. You cross and you don't turn back. So which means that once we decided on the path of economic liberalization, we said goodbye to socialism, goodbye to mixed economy, goodbye to centralized planning, and we welcomed the market forces. Once we did that, the basic definition of Indian national interest started changing. And in the process, we thought that now, because we are the second largest nation in the world, the Americans would drop Pakistan and opt for us. That is where I think a fundamental historical blunder was made, that the Americans and the Chinese need Pakistan much more they need India in the context of Russia, in the context of Middle East, in the context of Islamic world, in the context of Afghanistan, and the Taliban creation of the Americans themselves, like the Bhasmasur is running after them, the demon which could reduce anything to ashes it touched, and the Americans are worried about that. So the Americans did not learn a lesson from the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the presence. They did not learn a lesson of the British failure in Afghanistan to subdue the tribal people. And the Americans deliberately provoked and encouraged the growing of opium. They thought the Soviets would be addicted, but this opium is being now exported to the Western world, to America. And there is a nexus between the warlords in Afghanistan, the organized crime in Europe and America, and the trafficking in drugs. Now, but the Americans know very well that the relationship they have built up with Pakistan, which is not a democracy, which is a military dictatorship, ruled by an invisible government of the ISI, Inter-Services Intelligence Agency in Pakistan, no amount of elections will change. No amount of public opinion will change the relationship between Pakistan and India. And the Americans, having invested for 60 years in Pakistan, are not going to drop this ally very fast. Because they know if they do so, the Chinese will step in. And at the moment, as we know, the Americans and the Chinese have a trade war. We again anticipate the story. We shall do that in detail subsequently. But the legacy of history is that the relationship between China and Pakistan is almost 6 decades old. And Pakistan has gifted part of Pak-occupied Kashmir to China, where they built the Aksai Chin Road. And this is a very crucial element in the new One Belt, One Road initiative of China, which is running through to the port of Gwadar through this region. And China needs Aksai Chin also to keep Tibet subjugated, have the soft underbelly of Russia under its constant observation, and if possible, some influence. Also proximity to Iran and access to the warm waters. So I do think that the historical legacy of Indian foreign policy at the turn of 21st century brings us to an extremely interesting threshold where a complexity of challenges are emerging which are very new because the relationship between the major powers are constantly in a flux. The Russians and the Americans are either friends or enemies, or change their marks often enough. Chinese and Americans have intermeshed economies, but also engage in a trade war. India emerging as a power in Asia, but obviously China are not going to treat it at a level of parity. And all the issues of past remain unresolved, be it Kashmir, be it border with China, be it the disgruntlement of smaller neighbors around India, and the very explosive mix of fundamentalist, dogmatic Islam breeding terrorism, which threatened America at 9/11. But after that, almost 20 years, the Americans don't care about it. They make a distinction between good Taliban and a bad Taliban, are prepared to talk with them. India has had a relationship with Afghanistan, which is centuries old, but right now, India has a presence which is only counterproductive for its national interest. So we have these interesting problems and we have to face the future, but we can't face the future confidently unless we look back at least once and know what the history tells us.